How Prison Officials Manufactured Gangs and Gang Wars in Virginia Prisons by Kevin Rashid Johnson. No Virginia prison gangs before 2004. With the prevalence of youth-lumbered organizations, so-called street gangs, in Virginia today, it's hard to believe there were actually no gangs, especially no black ones, in Virginia's prisons prior to 2004. The culture never took root because Virginia's own culture of prisoners bonding based upon the cities they were from prevented it. The few gang members who did surface were mocked as bringing alien cultures into Virginia's own local culture. Virginia had always had a highly territorial culture against those from other states. I witnessed the birth and clash of gangs in Virginia prisons and how officials at Virginia's remote Red Onion State Prison, ROSP, and Wildlands Ridge State Prison, WRSP, manufactured the entire situation almost overnight, beginning in 2005. This all happened for a reason. Inventing justifications for two unneeded supermaxes. The gangs were created and played against each other by these officials because they were needed to create justifications for ROSP and WRSP to remain open, in light of both being repeatedly exposed as needed and previous justifications proven to be lies, particularly where the expensive construction and operation of these prisons contributed to a state possession. When ROSP and WRSP opened in 1998 and 1999 respectively, the Virginia Department of Corrections Director, Ron Angelone, fed the public the lie that these two 1,200-bed super maximum security prisons were needed to safely house Virginia's huge numbers of chronic, violent, and dangerous prisoners, and those never going home. In response to a flood of prisoner complaints about racism and abuse at ROSP, Human Rights Watch, HRW, investigated conditions at the prison and in 1999 issued a scathing report. That report can be read at Human Rights Watch or www.hrw.org. The report not only exposed extreme racism and abuse in the prison, but also that Angelo's justifications for these prisons were outright lies. HRW found that the vast majority of these facilities released back to society, while very few met the BDO's Supermax housing. BDOC chronically disrupted prison to feel even a fraction of one, let alone two 1,200-bed Supermax facilities. They repeatedly rewrote classification attempting to make more prisoners qualify for housing at ROSP and WRSP, yet failed miserably. They ended up having to transfer most ROSP prisons to lower security facilities. Then began an unprecedented move of contracting to hold waves of prisoners from other states and territories. Large groups of prisoners with ROSP and WRSP from Washington, Connecticut, New Mexico, the Virgin Islands, Wyoming, states, efforts to fill beds at Virginia prisons. This scheme quickly backfired as these out-of-state prisoners experienced abuses at Virginia prisons at the hands of WRSP and ROSP staff. Reported these treatments to their loved ones, the media, and organizations where they had strong advocacy networks and groups unlike the prisoners. WRSP officials like Frazier, a black man who died from being repeatedly electrocuted by multiple guards while he was strapped down to a steel bed frame. He used to look like a suicide. Of another Connecticut prisoner, Michael Austin, a white man who WRSP guards disliked, around and embraced black earth and claimed WRSP's rural white guards who him and sought to influence the racist values. Dozens of the prisons were beaten upon WRSP were the Connecticut prisoners. The killing of Lawrence Frazier was also featured in a documentary in a report on law enforcement officials uses of electric weapons. That report was titled Cruise Control. Back from advocates in their media, assemblies of families and groups from New Mexico and Connecticut protested in the WRSP parking lot and nearby town of Big Stone Gap, Virginia. Pressure was brought to bear on these prisoners' home states. Several came to Virginia and toured WRSP. Lawsuits were filed and the media was awash with critical reports, especially of the New Mexican and Connecticut prisons at WRSP. One by one, states their contracts to house their prisons at ROSP and WRSP, and Virginia was again left with huge numbers of empty beds at these supermaxes. With no one to fill them and need public justification to continue operations while facing waves of bad publicity, the VDOC had once again to change the security classification of these prisons. In 2005, RSP was down to max security to a maximum security level, security fixed to a maximum security level 5 prison. For the first time, the RSP became predominantly general population prisons. Population was cut in half, 1,200 to a little over 600. A large number of minimum security prisons were being moved to ROSP as custodial maintenance and other workers, called cadre workers. They were really just bed fillers. But still, measures had to be taken to get more prisoners to beds and justify these prisons. This is where the gang situation arises, creating gangs to justify these prisons. At ROSP, the newly appointed warden, Tracy Ray, promoted a sergeant named Tony Adams, who previously worked in the prison's dog kennel, to the position of lead investigator and Adams was ROSP's first gang officer. Ray became warden in latter 2004 and appointed Adams as investigator gang specialist in early 2005. A low-ranking guard, James Bentley, who still works as an investigator and gang specialist at ROSP today, was selected as Adams' assistant. This new gang-busting duo hit the ground running alongside their WRSP counterpart, Sergeant Steve. These from worldwide America, the blacks and browns became experts in urban brown culture and big organizations overnight. Everywhere they went and looked, they saw gang activity, and this wasn't accidental. They set out to deliberately create an organized gang problem and culture at these prisons where none existed before. This to validate their own job and justify the continued operation of these prisons. Before this period, the DDOC had no gang officials, no so-called STG, security threat group, units, no task forces, no policies on controlling gangs or gang activities, and so because there were no gangs in Virginia's prisons. At both ROSP and WRSP, they created cell blocks in general population, GP, and solitary confinement, exclusively for gang members, unofficially called gang pods. These pods were people documented and labeled as gang members. In most cases, they targeted people who were in fact not in gangs. They had developed a small but insignificant gang presence at ROSP and WRSP under the influence of prisoners from other states like Connecticut and New York. But by placing prisoners who weren't gang members in blocks and cells with those who were, this led to waves of prisoners joining gangs for protection against those in the blocks who actually were gang members. It also created an isolated environment, a hothouse, where the gang culture grew without resistance from Virginia's local culture. Those who weren't gang members when they entered these pods were active members when they left. This created a steady cycle. He tried to get his phone. He let me ride with this thing. I gotta give him this phone. All right. I'll talk to y'all later.